Okay, so this is the second video lecture on the topic of race and ethnicity. In the previous lecture, I ended talking about how race is both a myth and a reality. It's a myth because there is really only one race. It is real because we treat it real and because people really do look different. In this chapter, or in this lecture, I want to pick up with the topic and talk more specifically about ethnicity, which, as I alluded to in a previous lecture, these are concepts that routinely get interchanged and mixed up in our culture, and yes, they get mixed up, and they are two sociologically, social scientifically. These are two separate ideas. A great illustration, actually, of a very recent mix-up was the story of Whoopi Goldberg, and she said something to the effect that the Jewish people are not a race, and she actually got suspended from The View for a period of time. But technically speaking, Whoopi is right. So when we talk about race, we talk about some sort of superficial, visible biological characteristic that then our culture assigns meaning to, and that's precisely what was happening during the Holocaust. The Nazis were measuring lips and measuring ears and noses, and if they were of a certain physical dimension, you were sent off into the concentration camp. So they were treating these differences as if they were a race. But to be Jewish is to have a certain cultural background and a certain religion. That's what ethnicity is. Ethnicity is your cultural background, your language, your religion, and that's what it means to be Jewish. People can, in fact, convert to being Jewish. Now, again, that wasn't how it was treated during the Holocaust, and I suspect that's what got her in trouble. But she was technically right, right? Jewishness, or excuse me, ethnicity refers to cultural traits that would be religion, language, dress, where one comes from. Generally, an ethnic group has this sense of community, and certainly we see that in Jewish traditions. We see it in Amish traditions. We see it in Chinese traditions all over where people live in groups with each other. This feeling of ethnocentrism, I mean, that's really clear. That's really apparent in the Amish tradition and the Amish ethnic groups, right? They're so ethnocentric that that non-Amish and Mennonite people are to be kept away, right? We're going to cloister ourselves. Ascribed at birth simply means that these are states, these identities. You are born into these groups, right? You are born into a Jewish family. You're born into an Amish family. You're born into an Italian family, right? And then territorially, so one of the keys about groups that have significant ethnic identity is they know where their people come from. So one thing I like to do in a face-to-face class is sort of to begin when I begin this topic and to begin talking about or drawing attention to this notion of privilege one way to think about privilege is I'll go around the room and I'll ask people, where do your people come from? And the pattern is, if you are white, if you're white, you don't typically know where your people come from. Or students will say, oh, well, we're German and French. Well, when did you come? Why did you come? Groups that have a strong ethnic identity, or recent immigrant groups, they know their story. They know when their people came. They know what region of of the homeland they come from, what state, or what I don't know what they're always called, what district they happen to come from. But like my people who have come, on the Mayflower, I don't know what part of England my people came from, right? It's not been a thing, right? It's not been something, again, I've had to pay attention to. I have the privilege of not knowing when my people immigrated or why they immigrated. Excuse me. Apologies for that interruption. Anyway, so I was talking about the privilege of knowing where your people come from, and ancestry, which is something my mother is all into her ancestry organization. So, but ancestry versus ethnicity, ancestry generally refers to, like, historically, where do your people immigrate from. Your ethnicity could be historical, or it could also be contemporary. So the ancestry, here's an image of the ancestry of the United States, where people come from over multiple of generations. So the majority of the country is settled by people of German ancestry. So if we are, you could say, when people say, well, I don't know, my people came from Germany, odds are pretty good. Honestly, I don't know what this American down here is, what the red one necessarily means. And then you have another big section in here of Mexican ancestry. But your ethnicity, so that again is your culture. How do you currently live? So while all those people, right? So let me go back to this one. So while all these people in blue may be descendants of people from Germany, they're probably not living or expressing their German ancestry, right? Because their ethnicity would be, I guess, American. There is a debate amongst some social science scholars that there really isn't an American ethnicity, that because America was settled because we have an East Coast and a West Coast, and because we're settled from people from all over the world, we have we're a relatively new country. We have not really established our own sort of ethnic heritage, right? Now, that concept comes from that idea of a melting pot, but social scientists also argue that we don't really have a melting pot, because a melting pot implies everything comes together and you come up with something new, which would be like an American ancestry, right, or American ethnicity. But they argue that we're really more like a salad bowl, because we have all these different groups and they're all kind of in here, all mixed up. And you can go to any really big city and you can see, croutons and cheese chunks and olives, and they're all kind of separated out, right? And then you can come to a different part of the country, and maybe that's where all of the peanut kernel or all of the sunflower seed kernels all settle to, right? So I'm kind of using that metaphor of people. But the argument is that we really haven't become something different. We're still remnants, if you will. But yet the irony to me is that we may be remnants of various groups from other parts of the world. But if you look like I do from Kansas, you may not even be aware. So one of the assignments that I've invited students to do over the semesters is what I call your ethnic work. I should probably change the title of that, right? And that is to ask, where do your people come from? Call up a grandma or an aunt. Old ladies love to talk about this stuff. Sometimes old men do too. And ask them, their origin story. The students will say they don't know, and I always say, well, ask. Why did they come? Right? Who came first? Did they come through Ellis Island? Some 1 in 3 Americans, 1 in 3 American or white folk like me have descendants who are descendants of people on the Mayflower. But if you're a recent immigrant, we know those stories. Okay, I digress. This slide is dominant versus subordinate groups. So in sociology, when we use the term minority group, we're not talking about numbers, right? We're talking about power. In math, you might use minority to refer to the smaller number, but when we talk about in social sciences, we talk about a dominant group as the group that has the power, and a subordinate group or a minority group is the group that has less power. It is estimated that by the middle of this century, that white folk will be in the numerical minority, right? Probably still the political majority. In other words, probably still have all the political power, but not in the numerical. Another example where the group that had the power was the numerical minority, that would be South Africa, right, under apartheid, where the majority of the people were black people, but the people that ran the show were white people. Other examples, actually, in American history, have been the history of slavery, where there were certain parts in early American history in some of the East Coast states, where there were more slaves there than there were actually white people there, right? So in that case, they were the numerical majority, but they were the political minority. So you want to keep those two straight from the context of social sciences. I'm actually going to stop here because this is a big topic, and I don't want to try to cram it all into just a just a minute and a half or so.